And I'm pretty sure everyone knows each other, but I'm going to go ahead and do the brief introductions. My name is Richard Terrell. I go by Kirby Kid. I run Design Oriented, and yeah.
My name's Keith, and I'm Keith Burgun, and I'm a game designer, and I write about game design, and I make games, and that's about it.
Hello, Marcus Terrell. I'm the other brother, part of DO, game design, and such. Nice to meet everybody.
I'm Andrew. Everyone calls me Bleach. I've been friends with Richard for 8 years, and I've been part of the core of critical gaming and design oriented, and I do graphic design work when they need it.
Yeah, I'm Brett Lowy. I make single player strategy games under a company called Brain Good Games, and they all have single player ladders that were, as far as I can tell, pioneered by Keith. So.
Hey, I am Simon. Hair Machine is Nick on Discord. I'm professionally I'm a product designer and software engineer, and I've been in Keith's community for years at this point. Mostly just amateur game design, strategy games. Don't release a lot, but I'm super interested in the discussions and new ways of doing things.
Hey, I'm Brian. I'm a pixel artist and game designer. Mostly been working on game jam games, but now I'm working on I don't know. Anyways, working on a platformer game.
Yeah, so strategy is just an interesting topic. Something that I know a few of us specialize in. If you guys are working on games at the moment, you guys like to drop in, kind of start the conversation off, feel free to share those. I recently played Jim Wizard's Tactics. I've been playing it slowly, but chipping away at it, and that's something I know Keith made.
Yeah, if you want, I can just kind of give people an overview of that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. It's like a turn-based tactics game. Imagine like Advance Wars or something like that. That's kind of. My starting point was an older game called Fantasy General, which was an old SSI war game. And I really like some qualities of the old war games, the traditional war games, like tabletop war games. And I feel and I love the aesthetics and the production values of something like Advance Wars. So my idea was, and this is basically the elevator pitch for this game, is some of the tactical war gamey goodness of an old war game. The aesthetics kind of like a Nintendo or Advance Wars kind of game. And the emergent complexity and dynamics in gameplay of Oro, but actually magnified because there's so many more units and the board is bigger and there's just so much going on. So that's kind of the top level. That's what I'm trying to do with Jim Wizard's Tactics.
Cool. How many people here played Advance Wars?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Me.
Cool. Yeah, that's
I'm the only one who has it.
I wasn't gonna call you out, but yeah, it's a common touchstone for Nintendo-y, console-y strategy games, especially turn-based. The series started back in the Famicom, and it survived through the DS age, but haven't seen one since. Yeah. Now people are into Fire Emblem. Anybody have any quick opinions on the differences between a game like Fire Emblem and a game like Advance Wars?
Yeah, I don't like that the RPG leveling mechanics kind of invalidate the strategy to some extent.
Huge extent.
Yeah, and it kind of cuts exactly opposite to the idea of a single player strategy game or a single player ladder. In that, ideally, if a player is getting better at the game or they have more experience, then you want the game to get harder, not easier, and so that's kind of counterproductive.
Yeah.
Well, they're going for a different thing. They're going for a very narrative kind of RPG. They're basically RPGs, and they have, instead of the Final Fantasy combat, they have a little bit of a light tactical thing, but it's really not a war game in that old school sense, and even in the sense that Advance Wars was.
Yeah, so then just as a minimalist, I just wonder why not just make the thing, if you want to make a story game or storytelling game, why not just make that?
It is a bit weird, I will say, in Three Houses, which I enjoyed enough as an RPG, but it is a bit weird that it's I have this huge grid and all this moving around and stuff, and honestly, it could have just been Final Fantasy combat, you know what I mean? It doesn't really add that much.
Fight.
Really, in terms of strategy, honestly, if you take something like Starcraft, So everybody likes to compare everything based off of the chess. Chess is basically turn-based strategy, whatever. So you take something like Starcraft, which people generally assume to be a very strategic game. People supplement their strategy with a bunch of action, clicks per minute, right? You're not going to be able to compete with a pro-level Starcraft player because their actions per minute are so high. They're doing many more strategies per second than you are. So in that sense, like, Fire Emblem doesn't lose out too much just because it replaces that action with RPG stuff. There's still strategy to be had. Yes, it does nullify some of it, but some other stuff comes out of it, just like some other stuff comes out of the action element of Starcraft.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I think. I was gonna say real quick, just like when we talk about strategy games and like how this game has like less strategy. I think a lot of times people hear something like, this doesn't have as much strategy, and here it has no strategy. And like, it's actually really hard to bring something to no strategy. So like, there's a huge space, right? Like, it's really just a continuum.
Yeah, pure chance games, like zero strategy. There's nothing you can do. So just roll the dice and see what happens.
One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, kind of along those lines, is like the difference between like there's this property of games I like to call a skill expression, which is like how much strategy effort or like optimization you can kind of put in, or like how much there is to learn. But the thing that I like thinking about is like that doesn't really correspond that directly to like the outcome of the game, or it doesn't have to. Like so classic examples like something like poker or like Magic the Gathering would be another good example. Like there are tons of like optimizations you can do in deck building or even in play in Magic the Gathering that can give you an edge over your opponent. But the difference is that a lot of those optimizations are not like guaranteed to actually matter in the game that you play. So
in a single match.
Right. So that means that like there's still tons of strategy in the game. So I like to call it like skill expression, but the outcome is not like driven as much by the strategy. That's the inputs of your strategy.
That's very much like RPGs and how I've learned more and more about how to appreciate it, what they can do and what they can't do over the years. A lot of it is just in the menus before the battle happens. The battle doesn't have to be whiz bang or exciting or interesting or surprising or anything, but you're setting up for the battle, and necessarily that battle and the other battles that could happen like at the same time, you build your team up, you build your deck up, and you try to get some cool things to happen. I know, like, in Pokemon in particular, there's so many different moves, and there's some moves that are practically useless, like a move that does 1 damage, or no, it's a move that makes sure that your opponent survives with 1 damage. Typically not something you want to do in competitive play. It's really useful for capturing Pokemon, but then you see some people go way out of their way to build an entire team to make sure that that one move is like the linchpin of their strategy, and then it makes this huge dramatic thing, and he's like, I pulled it off, like stuff like that. But just like you're saying, there's a lot that can happen. It may never happen, and sometimes people enjoy just trying out really hard to see it happen once, and then they kind of put that away forever.
Right. It's funny, right? Richard talks about this all the time. Games are based off of real life things. Chess strategy is based off of war. Like, war generals applying strategies in battle to overcome their opponent. But the kind of place we get to when we talk about strategy games, chess or otherwise, we're kind of like, well, if you had the better strategy, then you would have won. You're like, you're like, hey, if it's based off of war, like there were plenty of generals who had a better strategy and they lost, right? Sometimes you just get dealt a bad hand. Sometimes you're in a bad environment, whatever, right? So the strategy not resulting in a win is not so much of a concern. Like the strategy expressing itself, right, is the major concern, right?
Right. So, but I do want to caveat my own point a little bit in that. So there's a danger in that if the outcome is not tied to the strategy at all, the input of the strategy at all, then it makes it possible to hide that there's nothing to learn there at all. So like Ralph Koster made a good example of this on Keith's show a while back, where he talked about how like when you pull a slot machine, the evil of the slot machine is that it pretends like there's something to learn about it, or there's some patterns that you can uncover, but there actually isn't anything to learn about it. So your brain is like trying to grok like the patterns of the universe or whatever, but there's nothing to learn. So ideally, you have a high skill expression game, and maybe it doesn't have the outcome that tied, but you still want to have there actually be things that are useful to learn in there. That's the key, I think.
Yeah, I would also add, like, for me, and I mean, I think, there's many different valid, like, things to value in games design in general, but for me, the idea the argument that, well, in a real war, XYZ, therefore it's okay if games function that way. I personally, I don't take any stock whatsoever in like what the real life metaphor behaves like. To me, it's perfectly okay if you know, like I don't necessarily think, I can see how sometimes you can say like, oh, this game is like kind of like this real life activity, or this game is kind of like this real life activity. But ultimately, you know, games I think are their own thing, and they don't have to map to real life things. And I personally don't feel like I can justify a game design, you know, a rule outcome or something because it's like real life. Like that has no value to me personally.
Yeah.
One major way it has some value is just it being understandable. I think strategy games often have a big problem with them being completely incomprehensible. Like I am a fan of chess, but I think one of its biggest problems is how incredibly abstract it is. Like if you watch a game of chess between two good players, you basically have no idea what they're doing. You have to like learn the game for, I don't know, 3 years to even start to understand what's going on. It's because the rules are so abstract, the way they express themselves, there's so little to hang on to in terms of like real affordances. So you're like, okay, this is, I always call this the Jackson Pollock game. It's like a big mess of stuff, and no one really understands what it means. So, yeah.
Yeah, Brian, did you have something you were trying to say?
No, I was just saying the affordances of, like, that's the main strength, in my opinion, of things that are, like, the one reason for making something realistic is if it has good affordances for what you're trying to do.
Sure.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that chess, it's the deeper parts or the strategy is inscrutable to normal people. You could say the same thing for fighting games, right? What's interesting about fighting games is a lot of people see it punch, kick, cool, that's all there is to it. And yeah, there are punches and there are kicks, but all the stuff that's making it difficult to play and exciting for people who kind of know what's going on, it must be learned. And when you're dealing with a genre like strategy, and we keep talking about learning, we keep talking about having enough complexity and emergent complexity and things like that, there's at some point has to be that long stretch or that barrier where people just aren't going to get it until they put in a little bit more effort and a little bit more and a little bit more. We hope that with any effort, they get a little bit of enjoyment so that they're never just like, well, I learned a whole deck of things and I'm never seeing this deck ever. You're like, well, I don't know, man, nobody's playing it. That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think that's part of the
value. Yeah, you want it to be like you start and you've got something you can do and you understand it on one level. You start going through like the levels until you get to the high strategy. It's not just like, chess is basically like you start and you're just terrible and you get repeated. And then after a year you start to understand something maybe. Yeah. And that's kind of a bad way of doing it.
Yeah, Richard Garfield talked about like a ladder of heuristics. So you want to have like a small heuristics that you can start with that are like kind of broad and rough, and then you kind of like refine those as you go. And also, I think that's a value in like having high skill expression, but like lower skill compensation. Is that like you can like do something that's like not optimal or wrong and still have like an early success, and like feel like you want to continue.
Yeah, some strategy games kind of choke you early on when they try to make you do the strategy right off the bat. And you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't even know how to think about what I did right or wrong. I just see game over. And I'm like, okay, maybe I'll try something else. So yeah, definitely teaching and ramping that up and having those steps seems pretty important for people enjoying this genre in the first place.
And then the single player ladder helps with that again too, right? Because you can start at a lower level and work your way up. Yeah. Or like gated content, like adding content over time.
Definitely. Keith, you can speak a little bit more about that single player ELO system for those who don't know.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the one of my game design theory things, which I think actually is not very controversial in a multiplayer context, is the idea that really strategy games can only exist properly, like can really only manifest themselves. The rules can only work if the player has something like a 50% chance to win. So in other words, like if I'm going to play chess against a grandmaster, neither of us are really going to be able to play chess. You know what I mean? Like, and so in a multiplayer context, we understand that, and that's why we always build matchmaking systems, because we're trying to find something around a 50% win rate for players so that the game can manifest and can work. And I think the same thing applies actually for single player, and that's kind of, I think, one of my more like weird divergent points of view is that I look at single player strategy games very similar way as I do multiplayer. And so in the same way, you need I think it's important that games, and we sort of like roughly get this in most single player strategy games by having like either difficulty modes or some kind of like options that can be selected by players. But like what I've always wanted is I just want to hit play, and then the game knows where I am at skill wise, and it finds an opponent for me. So it's like a single player matchmaking system, and that's basically how that works. It just scales the difficulty up with you as you win more, and down as you lose more. So it's just always trying to find that 50%.
No scaling down.
Yeah, without getting too far into the weeds, like I agree broadly that like I don't know if we want to talk about this or not, but like I agree broadly that like the game should get harder if you're doing well and should get easier if you're not doing well. But I'm not as sold on the exact number of 50. But that's kind of like a whole topic.
Well, it's a range around 50. It doesn't have to be exactly 50. It's never exactly 50.
That's interesting.
We can have a long conversation about that, but it's a very specific conversation.
Two things in response to that. Fighting games are these incredibly complex games that people put a lot of time and energy into, and then they built these tier lists and all these ways of comparing things in order to try to figure out what the heck's going on. One thing that people kind of settle on, where they're like, yeah, this game's balanced, it's crazy, when most, I mean, you'd want as many like 50-50, kind of like 50% of chance this guy wins and this character. And then people settle for like 60-40. It's like, it's still a good fight, right? It's still a good fight. You got to get in there. It's going to be tough, but it's still exciting. And that's kind of what you're speaking to. Like, if the range gets too big, then everyone's like, whatever. Like, this matchup sucks. And what can that person even do? The second thing... go ahead.
Yes, sir. No, go ahead.
The second thing I was going to say was I did a survey on chess and all the different modern chess apps and even a little bit of the chess books that try to teach people chess from scratch. And they do a lot of clever things in order to make the game a lot more accessible. Like one book, I think, gives you cards, and the cards are your moves. And you will either do this like chunk of moves or this. And other games only let you move one piece. And other games let you like tag team with a person. And or they remove a lot of pieces from the board. Like it's a simplified in-game. Like in-games are the way a lot of a few people started. I just thought that was interesting because there's a wide range of possibilities when you're talking about teaching people, right?
For sure.
Funny, what Keith said about the 50-50 and what Richard was just talking about when he was talking about Smash Brothers and fighting games in general, how people think they want balance, but they kind of don't. So interesting happened when they were making balanced Melee. Melee is notoriously unbalanced. There's about 5 characters out of the 18, 20 that are tournament viable, let alone good. So when they went to go balance Melee, they made a whole bunch of different dynamics, right? You have to make different dynamics to balance the game. Those type of dynamics are things that the players really didn't appreciate. Like, you have to make projectiles stronger, you have to make zoning stronger, blah, 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 to make different character archetypes viable within a competitive context. And build a bunch of matchups that are closer to 50-50. But when you start making a whole bunch of matchups closer to 50-50, you make a whole lot more things you need to learn. Tons and tons of more things to learn. And people actually don't want that, right? They want a bunch of smaller 50-50s. They don't want one character to have a 50-50 matchup versus most of the cast, right? They want to play one character be okay versus this type of dynamic versus that type of dynamic. If they're not good against the second type of dynamic, they'll change characters, right? But they don't want every decision and every matchup and every stage and every encounter to be, maybe my strategy is good and maybe it's not. Maybe my tactics are good and maybe they're not. I don't know. But sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. Oh, it's a flip of a coin. So why would you stick to something if it's just a flip of a coin all the time, right? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, go.
Yeah, and then in a multiplayer context, when there's nobody there to actually teach you how to play, when you're making it up as a community as you go along, it's just staring into the wilderness. Like, am I wasting my time? And then nothing comes back. You're like, I don't know. Should I switch characters? Who knows? Yeah, that happens a lot. We work with a lot of Smash players who are trying to, be competitive and go tournament, and we try to coach them and give them drills and things and just kind of talk to them and see where their head's at. And we have a lot of like first-hand experience of kids not getting it or like just being completely flummoxed by the fact that this matchup seemed like it worked like this, and now they do one move and everything's just out the window. And getting your footing in a situation like that, they want something safe and they want something they can spam, and then they'll start from there, right? They can rely on something at their core. Yeah.
Well, I like that point you made, Marcus, about like how they have to add new dynamics, and like what that basically means is like players have this game that they like that's like Fox versus Fox, Final Destination, whatever.
Yeah.
But so like if you add other dynamics, that means that they're actually playing a different kind of game at that point, right? And it might not be the kind of game that they actually wanted to be playing in the first place.
Yeah, that happened with a lot of heated arguments with Brawl and Melee, and one thing that I love about what Brawl brought to the table was zoning. And zoning with all the strange Nintendo characters, one of my favorite being an Olimar versus Snake matchup. And Snake is pulling grenades and setting off explosions, and this little douche is grabbing plants and throwing them, and somehow like all the interactions were working out to where they were each uniquely moving and uniquely aiming, and it was just an explosive, fun time. But Melee has nothing like that because it has absolutely like no projectile zoning characters whatsoever. So when I was like, there are pros and cons to every game and everything, but man, I've never seen zoning like this before, and they hated it. They just didn't want to deal with being hit by anything and the character never approaching. But to me, I thought that was an interesting shake-up in terms of strategy and variety.
Right. It's actually changing the game that they're playing. You know, like they don't want to play that game.
Yeah, they just don't.
I know who the quote is attributed to, but fighting game is a bunch of mini games you play one after another.
Yeah, different ranges. Yeah. So we had this range, and like I can only do so much, so I got to think of this as these are my only options, and I got to play to this. And when you get closer, you're like, haha, the game has changed. You can't do anything now. Yeah. So you imagine we have a conversation, and in order to make it as constructive as possible, there needs to be something like some guidelines, some rules, some game-like things. If we were going to have or continue this conversation on strategy, are there any things like articles, websites, even specific games that you would particularly like to mention, even though you haven't had the conversation yet? These are like the things you want to bring to the table.
You want us to do that now? Like suggest topics or
Yeah, you can.
what?
Yeah, if you are familiar enough with Figma, go ahead and make some comments in the box. Hopefully, you can see what's going on down where our cursors are. Limits.
Okay, I'm good. I put a couple things.
Cool. So scroll down. So imagine that we are trying to have this conversation, and we first have to outline some of the things we want to say. So all we have right now is just video games and strategy games. So with your voice now, you can just talk out loud. You can either mention some of the things we were already talking about, or mention new topics, and I'll organize them for us before we like dive in for a little bit more of a deep dive. So I know Keith had put information horizon, right?
Yep.
I'll take care of that. Anybody else?
I think there's probably an interesting conversation to be had about like the difference between like skill expression, skill compensation, and like win rate, and like what effect that has on like the value that people get out of strategy games.
Okay, so quickly define some of those terms, and we'll put those definitions right here with the info. But I'll skill expression.
Yeah.
Sure. That is a term that I think I came up with that it basically is the point at which information becomes known to a player. So let's say there's information in the state of the game because my opponent has a hand of cards, right? But I don't see that hand. So when the opponent plays the card to the table, now it has sort of crossed that horizon, and now I can see the card. And so I use this term to talk about usually that distance. Like, what is the distance between the point when you learn the information about the state and the point at which the information sort of like acts on you, or you must make a decision about that information. Okay. So something like rock, paper, scissors has like a 0 information horizon because
hold the
literally
elaboration for later. But I think
I'm just making sure it's clear.
Yeah, it's all good. We got it. I think skill expression, and
yeah. So specifically in the context of strategy games, like the context of like the skill of strategy games is like demonstrating your understanding of the system or something like that. So skill expression in this context is like the extent to which players can demonstrate their understanding of the system. Yeah, well, I mean,
Just-
in a single player context, it's with that conversation of, well, it's just the rate.
So in relation
the
to
chance
yeah.
at the beginning of a match, the chances that you will win, basically.
And chances you'll win. And
Yep.
your original statement was like the relationship between win rate, skill expression, and one more thing.
Skill compensation. I
Skill
think like
compensation.
the fundamental thing that's confusing, I think, in a lot of these conversations is like, I think it'd be useful to disambiguate skill compensation and skill expression, basically. So that's the extent to which you, in the context of strategy game, it's the extent to which you demonstrating your understanding of the system leads to the outcome of you winning.
Okay. Your demonstration of understanding leads to winning.
Or an advantage, I guess.
Yeah.
But either way, like, yeah.
Winning /
Well, or you could say it's a relationship between your performance and the outcome, maybe?
Right. Yep.
Cool.
Absolutely.
I had a more practical topic, which is ways to improve 4X games.
Oh,
It's
okay.
something I've been working on for quite a while.
So
And I'd be interested to see what other people are doing. It's a pretty hard problem, it turns out, because they're almost fundamentally broken. I think it's an interesting discussion.
That reminds me of Keith's project with Oro. Like,
Yeah.
1 year is valuable. Like,
I'm having a very similar experience.
Yeah.
I just keep
So-
chipping things away, and
You end up with nothing every time.
Yeah.
cool. So fixes. We're focusing on. That means we have to identify some of the problems and then the fixes, right?
well, I think we should probably define give some common examples of 4X games, probably.
Yeah, we will do
Yeah.
that in the next phase. But,
Sure.
That is a really good point. Let me say, design problems.
Because I might be thinking of different games than you.
And then. But okay, so you'd imagine we did a lot of structuring here that was reflective of some of the things we talked about before, but now seeing it in front of me, I know, at least from my point of view, I have a much better grasp of how these terms are kind of relating to each other and what's interesting about them. So if our next phase, if our next step is to explore the topics, this is exactly what Keith and Brett and everyone else was saying before.
I think one thing that there was, I think it was Keith's podcast with Brett, they talked about the value of games, and I thought that was, like, in retrospect, it's like very obvious, but it's that, there's different values that there's different aspects that different people value differently, and that I think a lot of communication can break down when you kind of are assuming other people are viewing things the same as you. And I think that, some of these things, like skill compensation is an example of that.
Okay.
Civ is the main example, I believe.
Okay.
Civ is the main one.
Sure.
The one I'm really looking at is Master of Magic, which is like Civ, but then they just added a million more things to it.
And subtracted a few things.
Yeah.
They subtracted diplomacy, which is pretty sweet.
It is actually in the game, but it's broken because of a bunch of bugs.
What's that game called? Master of Magic? And I can't
Yeah,
spell.
Master of Magic.
Civilized.
And Master of Orion is probably the other real canonical example, which is a more sensible game than Master of Magic.
Yeah, Master of Magic. Cool. Okay.
I could talk a little bit about Civ, but
Yeah.
I haven't played the other one.
Go ahead.
They're all pretty similar, yeah, to be honest.
Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, one of the fundamental problems that I have with Civ is that, like, the 4 victory condition thing. And so,
Or more.
yeah. And so there's this problem where, like, I haven't thought about this in a while, but basically, like, if you starting down the road of culture means that your best idea is to just pursue culture for the rest of the game. And so then you're not interacting with a large degree of the game space at that point. And so there's a lot of, like, wasted game that's, like, not relevant.
So
That seems like inefficient to me.
To a strategy to win doesn't.
Like, maybe you could design, like, a really good culture game, and then you can play that game, and then maybe you could design like a really good military game and play that game.
You could put them all together, but they just don't interact with each other, and it's almost arbitrary which one you choose. You're just like, I'm going to go culture, and then like, what reason are you using to make that decision? It's just you just decide at some point you're going to do that.
Yeah, so you need a lot more like cross.
Yeah.
I think the biggest problem with all 4X games I've ever played is it's a problem of scope. So like their match length is like 6 hours long plus, and so what that means, and you start out with like just like a single unit, like a little warrior and a settler, and then eventually you have all these cities, and so what it means is the game just collapses under its own weight after about 100 turns. Sid Meier, the original designer of Civ, admitted that no one finishes Civ games, and it's because it just collapses in on itself. It doesn't have the structural integrity to last as long as it does.
That's exactly the problem I see as the main problem. It's like it's a fundamental problem almost. It simply becomes unplayable. At the start, it's nothing, it's too simple. And then at the end, it's impossibly too complex. And there's like maybe a few minutes in the middle where it's good.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I read Sid's book, like his memoir or whatever this year, and like he was talking about how like they tried to like have some of that complexity like removed, like you'd have like setback events or whatever, or like you'd have like a famine or something, but players just they had built up this beautiful toy simulation or whatever that they loved, and they just railed psychologically against like having complexity reduced. So I think that's kind of like a conflict of expectations where it's like, is this a simulation game or is this a strategy game?
Yeah, for sure.
Seems like an RPG to me.
Right. I think a lot of people play it that way, like, or maybe most people even.
That narrative story generator thing is pretty common. You know, the story of my empire. And I don't want that all over because it's a sad story, but it's really necessary for the game to kind of work strategically, that you have something to act against you just gaining infinite complexity. Until eventually it's clicking end turns. There's so much. There's no point even doing it. You know, you're just overpowering everything at this point.
Yeah, it has a lot of the classic RPG problems we talked about with Fire Emblem, and how like the game actually gets easier over time. And Civ is the same way. At a certain point, you just gain a certain amount of power, and then it's just cleanup for like 4 hours.
And the power compounds positive feedback loops. So the more powerful you get, the more powerful you start to get. And there is some point where you just come so ridiculously ahead of the curve that it's over. But there is probably about 8 hours to play.
And then, like the other fundamental problem that's kind of pointing at, I think, is like, I don't know what somebody means when they say that they play Civ. Like, I don't know what their experience is like, because like I don't know what options they're playing with. Like I don't know whether they're playing on like an archipelago map, or they're playing on like God mode or Chieftain mode, or whether they're playing with like aggressive AI, or I have no idea what game they're playing.
Scenarios. There's so many different ways to play it. That's true.
So it's kind of like, gets back to that like play button idea that you were talking about, Keith, where it's like they kind of didn't actually finish designing the game in some sense, because like it's just like, hey, here's a bunch of games you could play, and like maybe you'll find one that you like. I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably there's a good one.
Any fixes, anyone?
I've tried a few things. Yeah.
You gotta finish designing it for starters. Get rid of the options screen and like say like what the optimal play experience is. Like tell me like how it will be fun for me to play this. Like that would be good.
Like the fundamental, there is a really fundamental difficulty with them, because this whole scaling, building cities is kind of the core of the game, but also it kind of doesn't work. This is the thing that's really difficult to like manage. I tried a bunch of stuff, like automatically moving units, which kind of a bit more of a kind of dwarf fortressy style thing, where they kind of just run around.
Yeah.
That just becomes uncontrollable when it gets too complex. It doesn't really solve the problem. It solves the problem of micromanagement. We just have a different problem of complexity, which is now it's just a giant mess of stuff you can't understand happening. And you're basically a passenger sitting there watching.
I had one game back in 2014 that I launched. It never got cooked as much as it needed to, but it was called Empire, the deck building strategy game, and it was on mobile and Steam and stuff. And it was an attempt to sort of fix this problem of 4X games. It was a weird game in a lot of ways, but the one cool thing that I thought that maybe would be worth exploring more in the future as a solution is that you have 3 cities, and you always have 3 cities. 3 is the maximum, and the resources of a city diminish over time.
Yeah.
And so eventually, it's just like I can't advance unless I ditch this one city. to build a new one somewhere else. So you get this kind of like leapfrogging of the three cities. It's kind of weird, but like that's, I think, maybe a step in the right direction in terms of managing the scope and keeping it in a range.
Yeah, like the snowballing problem, right? Yeah. Or like another thing that comes to mind is like double-edged swords type stuff, where it's like, okay, you can have another city, but then that like has this, like they did that a little bit with like happiness, but it's kind of like feeble. Like what you really need it to be like a strategic decision, like whether it's worth the downside is worth the upside. Whereas like having more cities is always better in Civ, basically. Like,
I think like the real thing you want to have is you want to be constantly building cities, also destroying old ones. So it's kind of like the map has more meaning in different parts at different times just throughout the game. So it's more, rather than building a giant snowball engine, it's more like you need to move things around on the board almost. Like you're moving where the cities are to get
maybe you need
at this phase.
Maybe you have different resources that are like more valuable at different points in the game. So like there's like I don't know, like early on like you don't care about oil, but then like later you care about oil and whatever. So that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's one interesting thing to note there. We talked about drawing from real life. We talked about combat and war games, and war has strategy because it kind of worked that way over time, and people continue to try to one-up each other in real life with different weapons and technologies and things. And when we model our games after war, we get a lot of that strategic interplay right there. So civilizations themselves aren't, they're only indirectly competitive. So if you try to make, with that as your source material, something that's more warlike and strategy-like, you're probably going to run into all these inherent issues of this was never meant to be this. This was never meant to be this.
Actually, you see that in stark relief with Civ 5 and 6, because they made now every tile can only hold one actor, so it makes it a lot more like a war game, right? Because it's almost like one of those old war games that I was talking about, like Fantasy General or whatever. Except it's not a war game. It's a civilization's simulation engine kind of thing. And so, yeah, there's this fundamental like lack of a decision made there about like what is this thing and what is it trying to do. And I think it's a case of like it's trying to kind of do everything and like and it does everything a little bit. But it's like a one size fits all glove. It doesn't really fit anybody,
Yep. Yeah. So just making the decision to have it be a strategy game is like a pretty strong step.
Significant things in the game. Yeah. At this point, I've actually gotten rid of cities, which seems to work way better.
That's cool.
You kind of stop doing the thing you start doing, really. But
right, is it a 4X anymore?
Yeah. Just don't make a 4X.
Right.
Cool. There was that one story I think Marcus had learned about it on an NPR podcast, but reiterate it, Marcus, if you can. How chess was made as a way to explain combat to somebody who didn't have anything to do with military things in combat.
Oh, that was a TikTok animated. Essentially, I think it was India. A military general went out to war and essentially did strategy, right? And then when he came back to his, I don't know what their structure is in India, emperor, whatever. He's like, oh, how did you win the war? He's like, oh, let me show you how I won it. And he put down pieces on a board and showed him what his strategy was. And then eventually that became a way for them to communicate with other people what the strategies they used on the battlefield was. And then that eventually became what we know as chess today.
That's really cool.
So trying to communicate things at the very core, create a system that was pretty elegant, pretty direct, trying to do the one thing it's designed for. Like, look, my units were like this and his were like crashing into me, kind of a concept. Very cool. Definitely lots of topics, lots of things exploding over here. I tried to capture everyone's comments. I think I got them all as we went along. The 4 interactive forums. Yeah. Go ahead.
The broader picture point on the 4X thing and the snowballing problem, I think, is that like I think you have to bake in really early the expectation that there's going to be like setbacks for the player, or like an antagonistic force in the game, or like some form of ambiguity or uncertainty. And like the earlier you can like bake that into like the player's understanding of the game, like I think the more that they're willing to accept it. Because if it's like if you play like the first 100 turns and there's like no antagonist, and then like an antagonist like shows up, it's like, oh, now there's a famine or something. It feels very much like out of left field.
Yeah.
But if like right at the beginning of the game there's like a tension between like having more population and like their food costs or like their unhappiness or something like that, then players are like, okay, like this is like part of the game, is like combating this like this double-edged sword nature of the thing.
Nice. But imagine if you see something like this top level statement where strategy as a topic is not worth discussing.
I guess like a general comment that I have. So I'm starting from the top level node and looking at these sort of 3 bigger nodes. And what I'm trying to sort of do in this web is find something that like sort of resonates with me. And so I guess that like it's probably this bottom thing, the leftmost, the empty allure of strategy thing. Where I think that's where I sort of resonate most.
Okay.
And so I'm just kind of like going through all these branches and trying to find, like, I'm just wondering if like, is that sort of how you imagine us interacting with this?
Yeah, like, I think when we were talking before, learning came up a lot. And there is a branch in here that focuses on learning, how important it is for enjoying all kinds of mediums and media in life, but in particular with strategy games. A lot of things we talked about was like you can have a deep game, you can have a complex game, but if you don't help the player understand it, then that's just a wall. Like you need to have good tutorials, you need to have something in there for them to work their way up to it, because ultimately what we love about big, complex, well-designed systems is that they the harmony between the elements, right? So that requires understanding it more of a big picture thing, and then also appreciating it for the little details and how they line up. That's a lot of work. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on like baby levels of strategy, but when you're still learning and you're piecing together some of those elementary elements, there's just not a lot to it but the straightforwardness of it. Like you have a unit in Starcraft, Marines shoots these guys can't shoot back, it's over. Like do it. And then from there and from there and from there, things get more complex and varied.
Yeah, like how do you reach that state now?
Start with like super concrete things, which are really obvious, and then all strategies about those kind of hidden relations. So once you've got down the basics, like I shoot a guy and he dies, or whatever the main mechanic is, then you can start to see how that plays out over many iterations. Oh, if I'm over here, that happens. Oh, if I use these units, it happens like this. Right? So yeah, like going from concrete to abstract almost is like almost the way the strategic thought kind of plays out. You go from like direct interaction to tactical interaction to strategic interactions, kind of going up that scale.
Yeah,
right.
Something Keith said before with the you should be able to hit a button and the game kind of meets you where you are. I love that concept, and in my mind I think about it in a lot more sort of splintered complexity, where if you need help like ironing out a bad habit that you have in your thinking, there could be something tailored for that. If you need help just getting to know other units in a certain matchup or in a certain map, it could know those specifics and just help push you and push you and push you around the design space, which would be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, most games don't do that. It's usually just people around it doing it. You mentioned chess. There's so many different techniques for learning chess. They've all just been basically made by people who play chess. The game doesn't have it in there. It's just this thing. It's like, there you go. But people have developed all these techniques to kind of, and any good chess app will have like chess puzzles, it will have endgame practice, it will have all that stuff built into it, because it's the only way you can really tackle something that complex is via this process of stepping through simpler elements, really.
Yeah,
right. I really like that idea, Simon, about like learning a game is like a sequence of abstracting further and further. I think that's really smart.
With the game that I made, it's called Enlighten, Learn the Art of Learning, and it's essentially a puzzle game. But what I did was, around the puzzle game, I built all these learning tools to try to help people do exactly what you're talking about. They see the concrete game; it's very straightforward. You just click the little squares and solve it. However, all the sort of mental gymnastics and exercises you have to do in order to go from basic level to mastery level, which the game does measure, it's such a journey, right? And most people aren't aware of it. Most people don't teach it. Most people don't know how to do it well. And the one game is trying to put it all in one package and show you like this is how you come to games by default. This is what you can do to extend it, and we'll meet you where you are. Hopefully, try to get you to pick up some new techniques.
Like a really fascinating thing about him,
feeling words on this web. So if anybody finds any feeling words, point me to them. I already searched the left side and found what I needed to find there. So the middle and the right side. If anybody finds any feeling words, tell me where they are.
Like things that are describing like emotions or like emotional reactions or something like that?
Yeah. Or at least not logical, because a lot of this stuff is richer logic. But that's actually
so like where you were talking about like the allure of strategy games, like that's like the allure.
Yeah, that has a feeling of going like, hey, you guys are being tricked by emotions or feelings, and
okay, yeah.
Yeah, I was already in there, and he has something here, mental superiority. I'm like, oh, that kind of smacks up the kind of attitude people take it. It's not so anything like that.
Well, for me, there's two different, I guess, interpretations of the phrase mental superiority. But like to me, what at first I think of is the rush of beating another human being. And something that I think a lot about in strategy game design is another weird point of view that I have, I think, is that like if a game isn't fun against bots, then I tend to think that that's a little bit suspect, and that like maybe a lot of the value is actually coming from a feeling of being superior to another human being.
It's an interesting
and that's something I'm really interested in thinking about a lot.
Yep.
Especially in light of machine learning and bots that can act like humans and AIs that's getting better at things that we do. Like that's a really interesting space to be like, what are we really enjoying in this? Is it the Schadenfreude kind of thing where it's just like, you suck, or is it something else?
Because bots are so much faster, and you can play with them as long as you want. They'll never get bored. You can play them 3 in the morning, and they're instant. So there must be something really valuable about that. Like, you know what I'm saying? And like, there's good values to it too. Like, you obviously, there's a social thing, and playing with other players and things like that. But there is definitely that like, I beat you, like I'm superior to you kind of thing, which I'm wary of.
So Keith, I have a question, like a thought experiment kind of along those lines. So you were mentioning earlier that like in a multiplayer game context, like say Starcraft or League or whatever, like you have like ladder, ELO, matchmaking type of thing, right? And part of the purpose of that is that you get like this 50% win rate, right? But also part of the purpose of that, I think, is that people kind of want to win. And so like there's no way to devise a system of players playing each other where like like some people have like a 90% win rate. Like everybody can't have a 90% win rate, you know what I mean? Well, kind of the question I'm getting to is like, if you theoretically could do that, would people prefer it? You know what I mean? Like
no, because 90% the game doesn't really work if you have a 90% win rate, I think, right?
But I sort of have the suspicion that like people, if they could opt into like an Overwatch where they like if you could have like a special Overwatch account where like everybody else has like the 50% win rate matchmaking, but you could like opt in, you could like buy this premium tier or whatever, and like you get to be like
cheating in CS, right?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm just talking about like a matchmaking level. Like you have the same mechanics and stuff, but it's like you're matched against people that are like low enough relative to you that you get like an 80% win rate. I think people would actually prefer that because of this like, psychological domination thing.
Totally, 100%. I mean, people cheat like crazy in shooters when they can.
Right, which is not about like understanding the game or getting better or improvement or skill expression. It's about winning, right?
Yeah, you can look at people's faces when they get matched up against top level players in fighting games, and they go up to the booth smiling. They lose badly, they're smiling, and they get up laughing like that was crazy. I got beat down because they expected to get beat down, and it's a very different story than like when they feel like they should have won, could have won, or whatever. Man, like the differences in the smiles is incredible. I've never seen bigger smiles than when people get beat down. They know they're about to get beat down.
Right.
That's interesting.
There's no shame in using someone who's just way better than you, I guess. And it's like, oh, cool. I was privileged to see him play, whatever.
That reminds me of like the roguelike balance thing where it's like you win like 1% of the time or something, but like that's the expectation that's built into the genre. So it's like, oh, it's okay. Like I lose every time. Like obviously, like, I'm not gonna get there's no way I'm gonna get the amulet of Yendor. Like nobody gets the amulet of Yendor. Like
it's very like experience. If you play a game for 10 hours and then die, and then you feel like, crap, that's like the roguelike experience.
Yeah.
There's something masochistic about it, But then when you do beat it, it feels good, obviously.
Yeah, so there's a big degree of like expectation that's built into like your interpretation of the result, right?
Cool. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys doing this. Very fun conversation. I'm glad everyone got to show up. Feel free to keep talking. I'm gonna try to, at least on my recording, and wrap this up pretty soon. But like, if anybody had anything else to say or wanted to talk about topics that aren't here, feel free to say whatever you want. The floor is completely open at this point.
Cool. I gotta go in a few more minutes, but yeah, if there's like one more volley of something that someone has in mind, I'm down to chill for another 5 minutes.
Yeah, same.
I will say my big brain thought when Keith was talking about people want to win 50% of the time, and I kind of came back and said, no, they don't. But now I'm going to come back around. So interesting. So I was going down the web, and I eventually got down to what I think the marker number is 26, which is talking about. Richard is talking about
26. You can follow my cursor if you want.
We're just talking about building learning models between people and what that essentially entails. So that's down the branch further down from mental superiority, which is further down from the allure of strategy. So essentially, the question is like, what type of interaction or person do you want to win against 50% of the time, right? If you go down that branch, right, I think that was the closest thing I found in the web structure. But the type of person you want to win 50% of the time against is someone you're trying to create a relationship with, right? Like give and take, communication. You're like, the most like extreme examples you can think of, like a parent and a child. Like the child knows nothing, the parent knows seemingly everything. But the parent condescends. It comes down to the child's level, right? Gives up a lot of quote unquote authority, quote unquote intelligence, quote unquote power, so it can relate to the child, so they can be a near equal footing, right? So that's that type of like give and take, 50-50 is what you want when you want to have relationships with people, right? But for just like randos, right? You're like, I don't care about you. I want to put you down. I want my mental superiority. Like you're my stepping stone. Those are the type of people like, I better be able to use my strategy and have it work 80-90% of the time, right? But if you want community, right? You're willing to like let go, at least in the non-competitive sense, and compare strategic values. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's actually. I was going to make a similar-ish point when Keith said about the main thing being that domination engine. But the other thing about strategy games is you can almost see them like kind of this abstract language for like exchanging ideas with another person, particularly if it's like a multiplayer game. So there is definitely an aspect of like, oh, you did this, oh, that's interesting, I wonder how I'll respond to that, and it is very much like a conversation. And that doesn't necessarily have to be about, just yelling at somebody or beating them. It can be about, just, I guess, they say something you've never seen before because it's the way they think about the game. So I think that's one value that you're not going to get with bots, you do get with people, that isn't a domination value.
I mean, theoretically, the bot should be doing things that you wouldn't have thought of, right? I mean, if it's a good AI, right? Like,
I guess it lacks the thing about the purpose behind it, right? Because the bot can't really have any idea what it's doing.
True. True. Like you can't bond with the bot after the game and be like, oh, that thing you did, Yeah,
it's RNG, right? It's just come out of an algorithm. So it's intellectually interesting, like understand and beat it or whatever, or understand it. But it's not going to have any like connection with another person.
There's an interesting mirror thing that happens when you're actually communicating to somebody you think is also listening to you, and it creates this really fast, tight loop that you see and you feel when you play games. And that's kind of speaking to what you said. Yeah, cool final closing topic. This is great, guys.
Fun stuff.
I'll let you know.
Thanks so much for doing this, Richard. This is really cool.
The format worked a lot better than I thought it was, so I'm going to throw it up on YouTube or something. I'll give you guys the link. Just let you guys know.
Sounds good.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I'd love to do this again if we could.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right, see you.
Alrighty.
See ya.
Right.
Take care.
Cheers.
Whoop.
Bye.